Senator Bragg.
Thanks. I want to ask you about some issues, many issues, business issues, personal issues. No, we'll stick to business today. Just in relation to superannuation taxes, or was that revenue?
No, that's us, Senator.
Righto. So the draft legislation on the new super tax defines superannuation earnings as the difference between the balances over a period. So is that a tax on assets, not earnings?
I might ask Mr Hawkins or Ms Kelly.
Lynn Kelly, First Assistant Secretary, Retirement Advice and Investment Division.
Yeah.
So the way that the tax is calculated is by comparing the opening and closing total superannuation balance. The reason why this methodology is adopted is because super funds earnings are actually typically calculated at a fund level, not at a member level.
Yeah.
And so we needed to have a methodology that was capable of being implemented across the entire superannuation system. Whilst maybe it may be possible for a self-managed super fund to work it out on an individual level, given that it's estimated about 30% of affected Australians actually have an interest in APRA.
So it's a tax on assets.
We needed a methodology that was capable of being applied across the whole industry.
Okay, so it's a tax on assets. Thank you.
Sorry, that's not what I said. No, it's a tax on the movement between assets, and that movement, when you take away contributions and you take out withdrawals, it then looks at the movement as a proxy of earnings.
So it's
tax
income
on
and growth.
Income and growth, yes.
So you're taxing growth.
Taxing balances.
Taxing the movement in the balance, yes.
Yeah, okay. So if it grows or doesn't grow, it gets taxed.
So if it grows, it gets taxed to the extent of the portion above $3 million. If it doesn't grow, there's a loss that's carried forward to future years.
Okay. So I very helpfully for this session asked you a question, last estimates, SQON 1704, where I asked you about whether there were other plausible examples around the world where there were taxes on unrealised capital gains. And the answer that the Treasury gave was, quote, there are examples of the taxation of unrealised capital gains in other jurisdictions. So that's quite a good answer.
That was one sentence.
Well, it was a good start, I thought. So maybe you could tell us some of the examples.
So Australia has examples. For example, if someone ceases to be an Australian tax resident, they are deemed to dispose of their of their assets, so essentially assets that don't have a remaining attachment, like real property to Australia. They are deemed to have disposed on that and taxed on any unrealised gains on exit.
Yep.
Denmark, their pension savings, I understand, are taxed on an accruals basis. It is hard to draw comparisons to other countries in relation to pension savings, just because Australia's system is quite unique in the taxation of it. Most countries run the exempt tax, and so taxing in the accumulation phase is kind of an irrelevant comparison.
Yeah, so basically Australia's moving to a tax system, isn't it?
So Australia has a concessional tax, and then an exempt. To the extent that someone has a balance over $3 million, a portion of that balance over $3 million will be subject to tax.
So Australia would be...
That's still a concessional rate.
Okay, but if you look at the G20 or you look at OECD comparisons, we would be, by moving to this system, tax on the way in, tax on earnings and tax on the way out. And on balances, so 4 points.
So this tax is estimated to only apply to 0.5% of Australians, and so the 99.5% of Australians will have no tax on the way out.
Yeah.
Sorry, but it's not indexed.
No, it's not indexed. The thresholds with which we apply tax typically are indexed, like Division 923 is a comparison in the superannuation system where both the threshold and the rate is determined by the
But
Parliament.
Div 293 is based on your income. It's determined by your income, not your balance. So this is unrealised, tax on unrealised capital gains on your balance, on your wealth, and it's not indexed. So, of course, more people are going to fall into that net as they get older. How many 25-year-olds today, on an average wage, are going to fall into this net under the current settings of this legislation?
So we don't typically do estimates outside of the forward estimates. I know that there have been some cameos. For instance, the average, a 35-year-old with a balance of about 70,000, which is around the average for that age group, who earned the average income for their entire working life, would not be expected to retire with a balance of $3 million or over.
Okay. So, but the decision not to index does mean that there will be hundreds of thousands of people that will pay this higher tax in decades to come up, won't there?
Our evidence is we haven't modelled that, Senator.
So you reject the actuarial analysis done by market participants?
I'm just saying that we haven't done that modelling, Senator.
You just did an IGR. We talked about what the NDIS is going to look like in 2062. You can't model this change?
We haven't modelled
I'm
this.
just saying we haven't modelled it.
You haven't modelled it? Okay, so you haven't modelled a... So hang on, so you just prepared an IGR which looks at the long-term fiscal position of the nation and you haven't modelled this new taxation?
So the IGR does look at how the tax concessions will change. So in terms of the projections in the IGR, the super tax concessions as a proportion of GDP are expected to increase from around 1.9% in 2023 to 2.4% in 62-63.
Does that include this?
So the increase is primarily driven by the earnings tax rising from about 1% of GDP in 2023 to 1.5% in 2063.
So does that calculation include this taxation?
It does.
It does. So you have modelled it?
So we've modelled, we haven't modelled the population, we've modelled what percentage of GDP the concessions will represent in that year.
So you have modelled the long-term impact of this tax?
Through the IGR tax concessions.
Okay. Right. But you don't know how many people it will impact?
So the work we did were around the 80,000 Australians, or 0.5% of Australians, when the tax comes into
25.
effect. In the 1st of July 2025.
Okay. And you can't tell me how many people you think it will impact in 10 years or 40 years? But you can tell me how much it will impact the budget bottom line.
So we've not done that modelling. What we do expect is that, sorry, just find my... sorry. Too many pages. So the only thing that I understand we have looked at is in 30 years it's projected that roughly only the top 10% of the earners will retire with a superannuation balance of around 3 million or more.
So 10%?
Top 10% of earners.
Okay, and what's the percent now?
0.5%.
0.5, so it goes from 0.5 to 10%. In 20 years or 30 years, you say?
So Adam Hawkins, Assistant Secretary, Tax and Transfers Branch. I believe that example which Ms Kelly just mentioned is a cameo analysis and demonstrates at the point of retirement the number of people who might have a balance exceeding $3 million. So whilst that might be the top 10% of earners at that point in time, that doesn't extrapolate to the whole population. So a share of the population much less than 10% will have a balance over $3 million at that point in time. Because there's also the point in time when your balance is going to be largest, is at that point of retirement. So it's not a rise from 0.5 to 10%, It's just an illustration of what someone who earns that amount of money over their whole career, who earns at least in the top 10% for their entire career, would have a balance over $3 million.
Okay. I guess it seems very odd that you know what the long-term fiscal costs or impact will be, but you don't know what the individual impact will be in the medium to long term, which takes me to this issue around farmers. So you're aware that there are a number of farmers that use self-managed funds.
So the issue around farmers and liquidity has been raised through our consultation process.
Yep.
And the design of the policy seeks to mitigate that through a number of ways. First is the start date, 1 July 2025, which means that payments won't actually need to flow until the 2027 calendar year. So that provides quite a long lead time for people to organise their affairs.
Do you think that will result in revenue leakage, or it will weaken the budget impact you're seeking to achieve by people changing their affairs before 1 July 2025?
It may be the case that some people may change their affairs. They would need to assess their own personal circumstances.
Yeah, do you think that will impact the costing?
So the costing that we did for this measure at budget did include an assumption that some people might change their affairs.
How many?
I don't have that breakdown of that number. We're happy to take that on notice.
Does the department know how many farmers are using self-managed funds?
So the ATO don't collect information on farmers per se, but what they do collect information on is the number of self-managed super funds that hold their assets in different classes, one of which is non-residential retail property. From what the ATO data, which there's ATO data's on their website, can see that there are less than 5% of the impacted population of self-managed super funds that have a concentration of greater than 80% of their assets in non-residential retail property. So that reflects that most self-managed super funds actually have diversified portfolios, and they do also are conscious of their requirements in their investment strategies to consider liquidity and risk.
Okay, can I just ask you about an example here, which is if a family farm uses a self-managed fund, it meets the liquidity requirements as must under the law, and has a failed crop and a loss of income through a flood or a fire or a drought, will that family have to pay the additional taxation from unrealised property value gains under this system?
So I guess the first point to note is the family business isn't held in the self-managed super fund. It's typically the land, and the land is then leased to the business. So what is actually in the self-managed super fund is the land, not the farming business. To the extent that there is a change in value and there is a decrease in value, then the self-managed super fund will have an unrealised loss which they carry forward, or the self-managed super fund can. So the losses aren't typically, capital losses are quarantined, but under this measure, capital losses are not quarantined. They're able to be offset against other income within the self-managed super fund.
Okay, so you don't think there's going to be a situation where farmers who have a bad year are going to have to put their hand in their pocket and pay a tax when they haven't generated income?
So I can't speculate on circumstances like
But
that. What I
reality.
can say, Senator, is that, just to clarify, it's not a farming business that is typically held in a self-managed super fund. It's the farming land. And to the extent someone chooses to put their farm in a self-managed super fund, they're required under the law to pay market rate rent for the use of that land. And that is what will be reflected in the earnings of the self-managed super funds, that rent that's paid for the use of the land.
Last question,
I have
Senator Brown.
another line, so do you want to hand it on?
Yep.
Paul? Yeah.
Senator Hume,